Good afternoon. So thank you for attending the webinar. First, I would like to make an announcement of the territory. I'm talking from the Mi'kmaq, Wolostiki, and Passamaquoddy territory. I also would like to, there is some housekeeping situation. So there is a person, you can address the questions via chat while I'm talking. So, and I'm gonna answer the questions after. So it's MBCTR questions. So you can address the question to that chat, and I will be happy to answer the question after I finish the presentation. And also, I have to say that I'm a lawyer, and I'm under the rules of the Law Society of New Brunswick, and because of that reason, I can't answer particular questions for a case in public. So I just can answer general questions. So if you have a particular case, I will be happy to answer the question of a particular case through email, or maybe you make your question in a general way and I can answer as a general answer for a general question. So I'm going to start. The subject for today is what are my obligations as a tenant. So last time we talked about the obligations for landlords. Now we are talking about obligations for tenants. So we are talking mainly about the section 4 of the Residential Tenancy Act. So a tenant is responsible for the ordinary cleanliness of the premises and any shuttles. Just to clarify what shuttles means, normally in New Brunswick, in Canada, there is renting for when there is an apartment, a house rent. So it could be come with a microwave, with a frigidaire, with an oven. So that is a shuttle. So the tenant is responsible for the ordinary cleanliness. So it's not keeping clean and keeping repair with reasonable time for any damage provided by negligence. So if it's not a repair because some if a shuttle or something in the apartment it's broken because the negligence of the tenant, so the tenant shall to repair that what happened there. But so I understand it's a fine line, but I'm sure in the situation a tenant will be able to understand, well, if the pipes just broke because, for example, and there is water everywhere, and because the building is old, for example, that is not negligence. That is a responsibility for the landlord. If I don't know, I maybe I didn't respect the instructions for a microwave and or used aluminum for the microwave and getting fire. So that is negligence from the tenant. So it will be something to repair from the tenant. So also the tenant is responsible for the people living in the apartment or being in the apartment. For example, shall conduct himself and require other person of the premises. That means, for example, I have a guest for a sleepover for my children, something like that. And the sleepover, the children became crazy and broken the windows. So I shall to repair the windows because it was the guest, but it was negligence too, not being careful with the children. So that is kind of the difference between any repair or damage caused by the negligence of the tenant or when the landlord have to repair. as I said, in practical, it's kind of easy to understand when it's a tenant obligation or when it's a landlord obligation. What happens if the tenant don't comply with his or her obligation? When a tenant fails to comply with his or her obligation, under this act, so the landlord may serve the tenants a notice stating the complaint. So it has to be in written, and we are going to see in the next slide. The notice shall be in written, shall set out the name of the tenant, the address of the apartment of the house. It has to indicate the regulation, and it have to be dated and signed by the landlord or the agent or the representative of the landlord. So the representative is maybe the secretary of the company, someone who is assigned by the landlord to represent the landlord. So, but it's a notice. So it has to be in writing. It's not the landlord say, oh, you have to repair this. No, it has to be a notice to repair when the tenants don't comply with the obligation. So, and there, so there is something here. This part don't apply for the failure to pay rent. So I'm gonna explain that later, but I want to go first back of this notice. What happens after this notice? If the notice is not, let's say the tenant received the call, that is not a notice, receive the notice in writing with all the requirements, and the tenant still don't fulfill the obligation, so the landlord can go to the tribunal, asking the tribunal to fix that. And because the tenant didn't fulfill the obligation. But without this notice, the landlord wouldn't have enough evidence to show that they did the notice for the tenant. So this doesn't apply for failure to pay rent. So failure to pay rent is another chapter I'm going to talk a little bit about later. But this is failure to pay rent, which is an obligation of the tenants, of course, is not part of what we were talking about before, about cleanliness, about repairing something broken. So when a tenant fails to pay rent, so it has to be a notice to vacate the tenancy. And there is a date for that. What happens, this notice has to be at least 15 days after the day of the notice is served. Let's say the notice is served today, so the tenant has to have 15 days later to vacate, to leave the apartment, the house. There is a form, so the notice has to be in the form by the residential tenancy officer, have to be all the information in the form, have to be served on a tenant, and if the tenant pay 7 days after receiving the notice, so that cancel the notice to vacate, to leave the apartment, the house. So just as a reminder, there is a notice, 15 days to vacate. The person the tenant pay in between seven days. That cancel the notice. There is something there, but I'm gonna talk later about it. So the notice to vacate is effective on the day of the specified in the notice. But if the landlord serves the notice, there is a residential officer who serves the notice, maybe. There is a notice to quit requested by the landlord. And in that notice, it said, even if you pay, still you have to vacate the premises. So that doesn't matter if you pay in 7 days. So when you receive the notice, well, I'm not saying you always have to pay rent, but if you pay in 7 days and there is nothing about not having that effect to cancel the notice, so you can cancel the notice, you can stay there. But if in the notice said, even if the tenant pay is not canceling the notice, so you have to leave anyways, even if you pay between 7 days or more. Other consideration respect to payment of the rent after a notice. So any payment of rent by a tenant is to be applied first of arrear of rent. So any payments, so the 7 days, the 15 days, any amount, first is to pay what is due in behind. So what is due before. When a tenant fails to pay the rent when due, unless this provides that the landlord may require a late payment fee, so the tenant has to pay the late payment fee. So there is sometimes there are questions about if there is a late payment fee or not. So look at the contract, look at the lease. If that say yes, if doesn't say about that, no. Only the landlord can take repossession of the premises. So the landlord can entry without permission, can't entry to the apartment, to the house in these possibilities, where the tenant has vacated or abandoned the premises. When there is a notice to vacate and has been served and is the time already. And we are going to talk about later about evictions. There is another webinar about that, but so we leave this gray where a notice to vacate, we leave it that until we have the webinar about evictions. When there is a notice of termination and it's the due about the termination, again, the next step will be an eviction, but we are going to talk about that later. When there is an authority or notice to quit service by the provision of this act, so the officer, sometimes after a process at the tribunal, there is a notice to quit, to vacate the premises. So, well, then the landlord can entry to the apartment or the house. And a landlord shall not regain possession of the demanded premises on the grounds that he's entitled to possession. So that is important. Even, and maybe I'm saying something that you already know, but it's important to make the point that even if the landlord is the owner of the apartment, of the house, that doesn't mean they have the possession of the premises, of the house or the apartment. Because when someone have the property but rent, they are giving that possession to the tenant. So the tenant is the one who is living there. So that is what I have for today. I'm happy to hear any questions, if you have so.
Thank you, Jael. There is a question, and the question is about the rent cap that has been announced. The question is, we got a rent increase notice for 10% effective this coming September, but our landlord has not been in touch about revising that since the announcement of the cap. What should we do?
Well, you should go to the tribunal. You can Google renting in New Brunswick. It's gonna appear the maybe I'm gonna put in the chat, or because I'm sharing the, yeah, and you have to go. You have 30 days to contest the increase, and this increase is really to contest. But you have 30 days, so please do it. Please contest the increase, and yes, the landlord is not respecting this rent cap at this point. It's kind of tricky because this is a bill at this moment at the Legislative Assembly. It's still promoted by the government because if the landlord don't respect, which is the case at this moment, he will have to make it retroactive. So he will have to reimburse the money that will owe you when this become a law. So I think it's better to complain first, because you have also only 30 days to complain. Second, because maybe probably this increase is going over the current law, which say that it has to be the same percentage in the region. And third, because if you don't complain, you will lose the opportunity also to have a reimbursement once this bill becomes a law. Thank you.
Thank you, Jael. I hope that answered the question. I don't see any other questions in the chat. So if there are other questions, please send them to me at NBCTR questions via direct message.
Okay.
Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions.
Wait a little bit. I'm gonna send the link for the rent increase here. So to the chat, so people can have it.
I'll put the snb.ca rent. Oh, sorry.
Yes, thank you. But the website, they did they even did an explanation and a rent increase calculator, which I find is kind of handy at this moment. And yes, and thank you for this question about the rent cap, because it's really useful and it's really on the current news for what is happening now. Okay. So yeah, I think it's okay, isn't it?
Yeah, there's just one more question, which is under what circumstances can I refuse to pay my rent?
No, under no circumstances. Unfortunately, there is no circumstances to refuse to pay the rent. When the landlord is not fulfilling the obligations, you can go to the tribunal. So at the website I sent also, you will have to fulfill a complaint, show the evidence that the landlord, for example, is not well. I have been here many awful cases with rodents in the house, or humidity, things like that. So I really encourage to go to the tribunal. And what the tribunal can do is asking you to pay to the tribunal instead of the landlord, and the tribunal will do the repairs for you or authorize you to end the lease. But there is not any circumstance a tenant can't continue paying the rent.
Thanks, Al. That's I don't see any more questions. Just wait a few more seconds to see if there's any more questions. If you would like to voice your question, you can request to unmute yourself. Not seeing anything, Jael, so I'll turn it back to you to end.
Okay. Well, thank you for attending. Next 2 weeks it will be the same webinar but in French, and we continue this series of webinar. Thank you. Have a good day.